September 12th, 1944. The Pacific sun beat down mercilessly on the USS Hornet's flight deck as Major Robert Cowboy Stout climbed into the cramped cockpit of his F6F Hellcat fighter. At 28 years old, Stout had already earned his reputation as one of the Navy's most skilled reconnaissance pilots, having survived 63 combat missions over some of the most heavily defended targets in the Pacific. The deck crew, identifiable by their color-coded jerseys, yellow for aircraft handlers, red for ordnance, purple for fuel, moved with practiced efficiency around the 12,000-pound fighter as they prepared it for what should have been a routine photography mission. Stout's assignment that morning appeared straightforward enough to be almost boring. Naval intelligence had ordered him to fly over Peleliu Island's northern airfield, approximately 500 miles southwest of the Hornet's position, photograph the installations, and return. Intelligence reports confidently stated that the airfield had been abandoned by Japanese forces, likely damaged beyond operational use by previous B-24 Liberator bombing raids conducted throughout June and July. The photographs would simply confirm what intelligence already believed to be true, that the airfield posed no threat to the massive amphibious invasion scheduled for September 15th, just 3 days away. The invasion of Peleliu, codenamed Operation Stalemate 2, represented one of the most ambitious undertakings in the Pacific Theater. A force of 28,000 Marines from the 1st Marine Division, along with elements of the 1st Infantry Division, would storm the beaches of this 6-mile-long coral island. The strategic objective was clear: capture the airfield to support General Douglas MacArthur's planned invasion of the Philippines. Military planners estimated the island would fall within 4 days. They would prove catastrophically wrong, but nobody knew that yet. As Stout's Hellcat roared down the flight deck and lifted into the tropical air at 08:15 hours, he couldn't have imagined that his next 8 minutes of combat would destroy more enemy aircraft than most pilots encountered in their entire careers. He certainly couldn't have predicted that his decision to disobey direct orders would later be credited with saving between 500 and 1,000 American lives. All he knew in that moment was that he had a camera, a full ammunition, load 6 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns with 400 rounds each, totaling 2,400 rounds, and orders to take pictures, not engage the enemy. The Hellcat, engineering excellence in naval aviation. To understand what Stout accomplished, one must first understand the remarkable aircraft he flew. The Grumman F6F Hellcat represented the culmination of American aviation engineering in the early 1940s, designed specifically to counter the Japanese A6M-0, which had dominated Pacific skies during the war's early years. The Hellcat incorporated every lesson learned from desperate aerial battles over Guadalcanal, Midway, and the Coral Sea. The F6F variant that Stout piloted that day was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower or 2,200 horsepower with water injection for emergency power. This massive engine could push the 15,000-pound fully loaded fighter to a maximum speed of 391 miles per hour at altitude with a service ceiling of 37,500 feet. The Hellcat's combat radius of 945 miles gave it the endurance to escort bombers deep into Japanese-held territory, or, as in Stout's case, conduct long-range reconnaissance missions. But speed and range meant little without survivability. The Hellcat's designers had created what pilots affectionately called a flying tank. The aircraft featured armor plating around the cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks that prevented catastrophic fires when punctured, and a rugged airframe that could absorb tremendous punishment and still return home. These features would prove critical in the coming minutes. The Hellcat's primary armament consisted of 6 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns mounted in the wings, 3 per side. Each gun fired at approximately 800 rounds per minute, meaning all 6 guns together could theoretically expend their entire ammunition load in just 30 seconds of continuous firing. However, pilots rarely fired continuously. Instead, they employed short bursts of 1 to 2 seconds to conserve ammunition and maintain accuracy. Stout, with his 2,400 rounds total, had approximately 12 seconds of sustained firing time if he chose to use it. Each 50-caliber round weighed approximately 1.7 ounces and traveled at 2,000 to 900 feet per second upon leaving the barrel. The kinetic energy delivered by these projectiles could tear through aluminum aircraft skin, puncture fuel tanks, sever control cables, and destroy engines. When loaded with a mixture of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds standard for naval aviation, the Browning M2 became devastatingly effective against both air and ground targets. The tracer rounds, which burned brightly in flight, allowed pilots to visually track their fire and adjust aim in real time, a crucial advantage in the split-second dynamics of aerial combat. The flight to Peleliu, routine becomes revelation. Stout's flight to Peleliu took approximately 1 hour and 45 minutes at cruising speed. He flew at 8,000 feet, high enough to avoid small arms fire, but low enough for his K-17 aerial camera to capture detailed photographs. The camera, mounted in the fuselage behind the cockpit, automatically advanced film and could capture images while the pilot maneuvered, freeing Stout to focus on navigation and situational awareness. The Palau Islands appeared on the horizon as a scattered chain of green jewels set in turquoise water. Peleliu itself measured roughly 6 miles long and 2 miles wide at its widest point. From altitude, Stout could make out the distinctive features that would soon become infamous in Marine Corps history. The relatively flat southern portion containing the airfield and the northern region dominated by the Umabregal Mountain, a coral ridge system that the Marines would come to call Bloody Nose Ridge after weeks of brutal fighting. As Stout approached the northern airfield, he maintained his altitude and speed, his K-17 camera clicking steadily, capturing overlapping images that intelligence officers would later analyze with magnifying glasses and stereoscopic viewers. The photographs would show aircraft positions, anti-aircraft gun emplacements, supply dumps, and any damage from previous bombing raids. This was standard reconnaissance procedure, practiced hundreds of times throughout the Pacific campaign. Then Stout looked down with his own eyes, and his blood ran cold. The airfield below wasn't abandoned. It wasn't damaged. It wasn't inactive. The tarmac was packed with aircraft, dozens of them arranged in neat rows, wingtip to wingtip. From 8,000 feet, Stout could identify the distinctive profiles. Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters with their long, slender fuselages and distinctive tapered wings. Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, likely configured for level bombing, and what appeared to be Aichi D-3A dive bombers. Ground crews in their distinctive uniforms swarmed around each aircraft like ants. Fuel drums were stacked in organized rows between the aircraft. Armament carts loaded with bombs and ammunition stood ready beside each plane. Stout's combat experience allowed him to quickly assess what he was seeing. This wasn't a defensive garrison force maintaining a few patrol aircraft. This was a strike force preparing for a major offensive operation. He counted rapidly, his mind calculating even as his pulse quickened. 40 aircraft, possibly more, all armed, all fueled, all clearly being prepared for imminent launch. The intelligence assessment had been catastrophically wrong, and Stout immediately understood the implications. The tactical situation, understanding the stakes. The invasion fleet bound for Peleliu was already underway. 28,000 Marines aboard transport ships were steaming toward the island, scheduled to hit the beaches at 08:30 hours on September 15th, just 72 hours away. The fleet included dozens of transport ships, APA and AKA types, tank landing ships, LSTs, amphibious tractors, LVTs, destroyer escorts, cruisers, and battleships for naval gunfire support. It represented one of the largest assemblies of men and material in the Pacific War to date. The American amphibious assault doctrine, refined through bloody lessons at Tarawa, Saipan, and Guam, called for overwhelming firepower during the landing phase. Naval guns would pound the beaches and inland positions. Carrier aircraft would strafe and bomb defensive installations. Then at H hour, waves of Marines in armored amphibious tractors would race toward shore under covering fire, aiming to establish a beachhead before Japanese defenders could organize effective resistance. But this doctrine had one critical vulnerability: the approach phase. For approximately 30 minutes, from when the Marines left the relative safety of their transport ships until they reached the beach, they were confined in slow-moving, lightly armored vehicles that couldn't maneuver effectively. During this window, they were devastatingly vulnerable to air attack. Japanese military planners understood this vulnerability perfectly. Throughout the Pacific Campaign, Japanese commanders had learned that attacking American amphibious forces during the landing phase offered their best chance of inflicting catastrophic casualties. Aircraft could strafe the packed landing craft with machine gun and cannon fire, or drop bombs directly onto the massed formations of vehicles churning toward shore. The Americans, committed to their assault and unable to turn back, would have no choice but to absorb the losses and press forward. This was precisely what the 40 aircraft at Peleliu's northern airfield were positioned to accomplish. If launched at the optimal moment, as the first waves of Marines left their transport ships, these aircraft could potentially destroy dozens of landing craft before they reached the beach. With 30 or 40 Marines packed into each LVT, a single bomb or sustained strafing run could kill everyone aboard. 40 aircraft making coordinated attacks could transform the beach landing from a difficult operation into an absolute bloodbath. Stout recognized all of this in the seconds it took him to count the aircraft below. He'd flown close air support at Tarawa in November 1943, where he'd witnessed the carnage when Japanese aircraft penetrated the American air cover. He'd seen what a single bomb could do to a landing craft packed with Marines. The memory of men burning in the water, trapped in sinking vehicles, screaming for help that couldn't reach them, those images never left a combat pilot's mind. The decision, orders versus initiative. Stout's training, Navy regulations, and his explicit orders from USS Hornet's Air Operations Officer all dictated the same course of action. Complete the photographic reconnaissance, radio coordinates, and initial assessment to the carrier, then return to base immediately. Under no circumstances should a single reconnaissance aircraft engage multiple enemy targets, especially not over a heavily defended enemy airfield bristling with anti-aircraft weapons. The standard procedure made perfect military sense. Stout's photographs would provide detailed intelligence on aircraft types, numbers, positions, and defensive installations. Strike planners aboard Hornet could study these photographs, coordinate with other carriers in the task force, and organize a proper strike package. Multiple fighter bombers with escort fighters carefully timed to catch the Japanese aircraft on the ground, with enough force to overwhelm the defenses and ensure destruction of the target. This approach minimized risk to American pilots while maximizing the likelihood of mission success. But standard procedure assumed time was available. Strike planning typically required several hours. Intelligence officers needed to analyze the photographs, brief the strike leaders, coordinate the multi-carrier attack, prep the aircraft, brief the pilots, and launch the mission, a process that could easily consume 6 to 8 hours, possibly longer if weather or other operational priorities intervened. Stout circled higher, his mind racing through scenarios. If he returned immediately and reported what he'd found, how long before a strike aircraft reached this target? 6 hours minimum, possibly 12. What would the Japanese do in that time? They might disperse the aircraft to revetments, making them harder to destroy. They might move them to alternative airfields elsewhere in the Peleliu chain, or, most concerning, they might complete their preparations and launch them against the approaching invasion fleet. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had likely already spotted the American fleet. Japanese commanders knew the invasion was coming. They just didn't know exactly when or where. Those 40 aircraft represented their best defensive asset, and they would use them at the optimal moment. If Stout flew away now following orders, those aircraft might be airborne and attacking American Marines within 72 hours. But if he attacked alone now, he could potentially destroy them before they ever launched. The decision violated every principle of military discipline. Orders existed for good reasons. The chain of command functioned on trust that subordinates would execute their assigned missions without improvisation. Reconnaissance pilots who decided to become attack pilots without authorization created chaos in operational planning. Yet Stout also understood the concept of commander's intent, the principle that subordinates should understand the purpose behind orders and exercise initiative when circumstances change. His orders were to photograph the airfield to assess threats to the invasion. He'd found a critical threat. The intent behind his mission was to protect the invasion force. Destroying those aircraft directly accomplished that intent, just not through the prescribed method. The decision took 30 seconds. Stout pushed his throttle forward and pointed the Hellcat's nose toward the airfield. He would attack alone, against orders, knowing he might face court-martial if he survived. The alternative, watching those 40 aircraft slaughter Marines, was simply unacceptable. The attack. 8 minutes that changed everything. Stout's tactical approach demonstrated both his experience and his analytical mind. He didn't simply dive toward the airfield blazing away. Instead, he studied the layout, identified critical vulnerabilities, and formulated a plan that maximized his limited ammunition. The Japanese had made several critical mistakes in their haste to prepare for the American invasion. First, they'd parked the aircraft too close together, presumably to expedite fueling and arming operations. This clustering meant fire and explosions could spread rapidly from one aircraft to adjacent ones. Second, they'd positioned fuel drums in the open near the aircraft. Each drum contained approximately 55 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, essentially a bomb waiting for ignition. Third, their anti-aircraft gun positions, while numerous, were positioned primarily to defend against high-altitude bombing attacks, not against a low-level strafing run from an unexpected direction. Stout's plan exploited all three vulnerabilities. He would make 2 passes at maximum speed and minimum altitude. The first pass would target fuel drums on the northern end of the field, using the explosions to ignite nearby aircraft and start a chain reaction. The second pass would target the southern end of the field before the anti-aircraft gunners could fully adjust to his tactics. Between the 2 passes, he'd expend all 2,400 rounds of ammunition, and then he'd leave immediately, whether or not all aircraft were destroyed. At 2,000 feet altitude, Stout pushed the throttle to its forward stop, the Pratt & Whitney engine responding with a roar that pushed the Hellcat past 400 miles per hour. He dropped to barely 50 feet above the jungle canopy, so low that his propeller wash created visible disturbance in the treetops. At this altitude and speed, he would appear suddenly with almost no warning, giving anti-aircraft gunners perhaps 2 or 3 seconds to track and fire, not enough time for effective defense. The airfield appeared through a gap in the trees. Ground crew members looked up, their faces registering confusion. In the split second before Stout opened fire, some of these men probably assumed the approaching aircraft was Japanese. After all, what American pilot would be crazy enough to attack an entire airfield alone? Stout's targeting was precise. He aimed not at the aircraft themselves, but at the fuel drums positioned near them. He squeezed the trigger, and all 6 Browning M2 machine guns erupted simultaneously. The sound was overwhelming, even inside the cockpit, a thunderous hammering that vibrated through the entire airframe. Tracer rounds marked his line of fire in brilliant streaks of light, allowing him to adjust his aim in real time. The first burst struck a Mitsubishi Zero, 50 caliber rounds punching through the fighter's thin aluminum skin like paper. Fuel sprayed from ruptured tanks. But Stout didn't focus on the aircraft itself. He walked his fire toward the cluster of fuel drums positioned beside it. The effect was instantaneous and spectacular. 50 caliber incendiary rounds ignited the aviation fuel as the drums ruptured. The resulting fireball climbed 50 feet into the air, a boiling mass of orange flame and black smoke. The blast wave was powerful enough to rock Stout's Hellcat even as he pulled up hard, climbing away from the inferno he'd created. Behind him, the fire spread exactly as he'd calculated. The burning Zero ignited the aircraft parked beside it. That fire spread to another, then another. Aviation fuel, bombs, and ammunition began cooking off in a cascading series of explosions. Within 15 seconds, nearly a dozen aircraft were engulfed in flames. Japanese ground crew members scattered in all directions, abandoning any attempt to save equipment or fight the fires. The anti-aircraft gunners finally reached their positions and opened fire. Tracers arced through the sky, some passing within feet of Stout's canopy. He felt impacts shudder through the airframe as 20mm rounds punched through his tail section. Warning lights illuminated on his instrument panel, hydraulic pressure dropping, oil temperature rising. But the rugged Hellcat continued to fly, its Pratt & Whitney engine maintaining power despite the damage. Stout should have left then. He'd accomplished more than any reasonable plan would have predicted. Nearly half the aircraft were burning, mission success by any measure. But looking down, he saw that approximately 20 aircraft on the southern end of the airfield remained untouched. If he left now, those aircraft could still launch against the Marines. The decision to make a second pass was tactical suicide by conventional doctrine. The anti-aircraft gunners were now fully alert and tracking him. They knew his speed, altitude, and likely attack angle. Coming back gave them every advantage. The probability of being shot down increased dramatically. With each second, he remained in the engagement zone. Stout rolled inverted and dove anyway. The anti-aircraft fire intensified immediately. The Japanese gunners had positioned their weapons well, creating overlapping fields of fire. Tracers filled the sky in what pilots called flak soup, so dense that flying through it seemed impossible. Stout jinked left, then right, never maintaining straight and level flight for more than 2 seconds. This made accurate shooting nearly impossible, but it also made his own accuracy suffer. He was trading precision for survival. More rounds struck his Hellcat. Metal tore somewhere in the fuselage. A hydraulic line ruptured, spraying fluid across the inside of his canopy. The aircraft's response to control inputs became sluggish. Something was damaged in the tail, affecting the elevator or rudder linkages. But Stout completed his firing pass. His remaining ammunition, approximately 4,200 rounds, hammered into the bombers parked on the southern end of the field. He walked his fire across a fuel truck, which exploded violently enough to flip a Nakajima bomber onto its back. Burning fuel spread across the tarmac in rivers of fire, igniting stacked ammunition crates that detonated in rapid succession. The bomber's own ordnance began cooking off bombs and torpedoes, exploding as fire reached them, tearing the aircraft apart from within. The explosions fed on each other, creating a conflagration that consumed everything in that section of the airfield. Stout's guns fell silent, empty, every round expended. He pulled up hard, coaxing maximum performance from the damaged Hellcat, climbing away from the inferno below. Looking back, he saw that the entire airfield had become a sea of flames. Every aircraft was either burning or already destroyed. Fuel dumps were exploding, structures were collapsing. The smoke column rose thousands of feet into the tropical sky, visible for dozens of miles. 8 minutes. From his initial attack run to clearing the engagement zone, the entire action had lasted 8 minutes. The return, flying a damaged aircraft Stout, turned the Hellcat's nose toward the ocean and began the lonely flight back to USS Hornet. Only now, with adrenaline beginning to fade, did he fully assess his situation. The aircraft was badly damaged. Hydraulic pressure had dropped to nearly zero, meaning his landing gear might not extend, or might not lock if it did extend. Oil pressure was slowly declining. Something in the engine had been damaged, probably a line punctured by shrapnel. Control response was sluggish and imprecise, requiring constant attention to maintain level flight. The flight computer indicated his fuel remaining was sufficient to reach the carrier, assuming no further complications. But a damaged aircraft consumed fuel less efficiently, and if the engine failed completely, he'd have to ditch in the ocean with minimal chance of rescue. The psychological aspect of the return flight was perhaps more challenging than the combat itself. During the attack, Stout had operated on training and instinct, making split-second decisions without time for doubt. Now he had nearly 2 hours to consider what he'd done. He'd directly violated explicit orders. Instead of photographing the airfield and returning, he'd single-handedly attacked it. He'd risked his aircraft, his life, and the intelligence value of his reconnaissance photographs, all on his own initiative, without authorization from anyone in the chain of command. Courts-martial had been convened for less serious infractions. Pilots who broke formation without orders, who engaged enemy aircraft when instructed not to, who deviated from mission parameters. These offenses had resulted in everything from formal reprimands to removal from flight status. Stout had done all of these simultaneously, yet he had also potentially saved hundreds or thousands of American lives. If those 40 aircraft had attacked the invasion fleet, the casualties could have been catastrophic. Was initiative that saved lives worth the violation of military discipline? That question would ultimately be answered by officers far above Stout's rank. USS Hornet appeared on the horizon. The massive carrier was turning into the wind, preparing to recover aircraft. Stout radioed the tower and reported his situation. Aircraft damaged, hydraulic system compromised, uncertain landing gear status, requesting priority landing clearance. The landing signal officer, LSO, acknowledged and cleared the deck. Other aircraft in the landing pattern were waved off, directed to circle, while Stout attempted his approach. On the carrier's deck, the crash crew stood ready with firefighting equipment. Stout lowered his landing gear. The main wheels extended partially, visible through gaps in the wing, but the indicator light showed only partial lock. The gear wasn't fully seated. Whether it would hold under landing forces was uncertain. He had no choice but to try. The approach was difficult. With compromised hydraulics, the Hellcat's flight controls responded sluggishly. Stout fought to maintain proper speed and altitude, coming in slightly faster than normal to ensure he could catch an arresting wire despite the heavy damaged aircraft. The LSO gave him the Roger signal cleared to land. Stout crossed the carrier's stern, chopped power, and brought the Hellcat down hard. The tailhook caught the second arresting wire. The aircraft slammed onto the deck with a metal shrieking impact that buckled the partially locked landing gear. The Hellcat slewed sideways before the arresting wire brought it to a violent stop. Deck crew members in their colored jerseys swarmed the aircraft immediately. Stout shut down the engine and sat for a moment in sudden silence, his hands trembling with adrenaline aftermath. He'd made it back. Against the odds, despite the damage, he'd brought the Hellcat home. Aftermath, recognition, and strategic impact. As Stout climbed down from the cockpit, he found himself surrounded by officers. The air boss demanded to know why he'd returned with combat damage from a photography mission. The squadron commander wanted an explanation for breaking radio silence. The intelligence officer wanted to know what the hell had happened over Peleliu. Deck crew members examining the Hellcat were shocked at the extent of damage. The tail section was shredded by 20mm cannon fire. The fuselage had multiple puncture holes from automatic weapons. The hydraulic system was destroyed. The landing gear was damaged beyond field repair. The paint was scorched black in several places from flying through explosions and intense heat. This wasn't just battle damage. This was evidence of sustained combat against heavy opposition. Stout's initial verbal report was simple and direct. The airfield wasn't abandoned as intelligence had reported. It was packed with approximately 40 Japanese aircraft being armed and fueled for what appeared to be a major strike operation. The aircraft were positioned to attack the invasion fleet. He'd engaged them and destroyed them, all of them. The airfield was no longer operational. The intelligence officer asked him to repeat the number. 40 aircraft destroyed by one pilot in one aircraft in a single engagement? That seemed statistically impossible. The most successful fighter pilots in the Pacific typically shot down 2 or 3 aircraft per mission when they were lucky. 4 or 5 made a pilot an ace. 40 was beyond comprehension. But reconnaissance photographs didn't lie. The following day, a photographic reconnaissance mission flew over Peleliu's northern airfield. The images confirmed everything Stout had reported. The airfield was completely destroyed. 40 aircraft, the exact number Stout had estimated, were visible as burned-out hulks scattered across blackened tarmac. Fuel dumps were cratered. Structures were reduced to rubble. No aircraft remained operational. the facility would require months of reconstruction before it could support air operations again. Intelligence officers revised their assessment of Japanese air strength in the Peleliu Islands. Instead of facing 40 aircraft on D-Day, the Marines would hit the beaches with complete air superiority. The Japanese air threat had been eliminated not by a carefully planned multi-carrier strike package, but by one pilot who'd refused to follow orders because he understood what was at stake. The Navy awarded Major Robert F. Stout the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for combat valor, exceeded only by the Medal of Honor. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism and aggressive fighting spirit in attacking superior enemy forces alone without regard for his personal safety. His decision to engage had directly saved American lives. The Navy recognized that sometimes the judgment of the person on the ground, seeing the situation with their own eyes, superseded the orders given by commanders operating from incomplete information. The Battle of Peleliu, validation of Stout's decision. The Marines landed on Peleliu's western beaches at 8:30 hours on September 15, 1944, exactly as scheduled. The initial landings proceeded under intense artillery and mortar fire from Japanese positions in the Coral Ridges, but without air attack. The 40 aircraft that should have been strafing the landing craft and bombing the transport ships were already destroyed, reduced to burned wreckage 500 miles away on the northern airfield. The Battle of Peleliu would prove to be one of the most brutal engagements in the Pacific War. Japanese forces under Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had abandoned the previous tactic of defending at the water's edge, instead constructing an intricate system of fortified caves and bunkers throughout the Umabrogal mountain complex. These positions, interconnected by tunnels and reinforced with concrete, proved nearly impervious to naval gunfire and aerial bombardment. The battle lasted 73 days rather than the estimated 4. The 1st Marine Division suffered 54% casualties in the 1st Marine Regiment, with the 5th and 7th Regiments taking 43% and 46% casualties, respectively. Overall, the division and attached units suffered 7,790 casualties on 159 dead, 43 missing, and 6,188 wounded. The 81st Infantry Division, which reinforced the Marines, suffered 208 dead and 1,093 wounded. The greater than 40% casualty rate made Peleliu the bloodiest amphibious assault in the Pacific campaign. The fighting was characterized by extreme heat, 115 degree mustache heat index, difficult terrain, determined Japanese defenders, and the brutal cave-to-cave, bunker-to-bunker combat that defined the later Pacific battles. Marines used flamethrowers, demolition charges, and close-quarters combat to clear each fortified position. The coral limestone ridges channeled attacks into killing zones where Japanese machine guns and mortars inflicted horrific casualties. Yet despite these catastrophic losses, military historians universally agree that casualties would have been far worse without Stout's attack. The first hours of an amphibious landing represent the most vulnerable phase of the operation. Troops are packed in slow-moving landing craft, unable to take cover or effectively return fire against attacking aircraft. Transport ships loaded with thousands of Marines, make massive targets for bomb and torpedo attacks. The 40 Japanese aircraft at Peleliu's northern airfield, if launched during the vulnerable first hours of the invasion, could have caused catastrophic losses. Coordinated strafing runs on landing craft could have killed hundreds of Marines before they ever reached the beach. Torpedo and bomb attacks on transport ships could have sunk vessels loaded with thousands of troops, equipment, and supplies. The beach landing, already difficult, could have been transformed into an absolute disaster. Post-war analysis by Marine Corps historians calculated that Stout's solo attack probably saved between 500 and 1,000 American lives in the first day of the invasion alone. His 8 minutes of combat, accomplished at exactly the critical moment before the Japanese could launch their aircraft, had achieved what a full squadron of bombers might have accomplished, and he'd done it when it mattered most, removing the threat before it could materialize. By September 17th, American forces had captured the southern airfield on Peleliu and begun operating Marine Corps F4U Corsairs from the repaired runway. These aircraft provided critical close air support throughout the remainder of the battle, flying sorties so close to friendly lines that pilots often never raised their landing gear between takeoff and landing. This air support, unopposed by Japanese aircraft thanks to Stout's action, helped reduce Marine casualties during the grinding combat in the Umur-Brigol. The broader context: tactical initiative in military operations. Stout's attack over Peleliu represents a classic case study in military leadership at the tactical level, one that's still taught in command courses today. The mission demonstrates the critical difference between following orders and understanding commander's intent. Commander's intent is a military concept that emphasizes understanding the purpose behind orders rather than merely executing them mechanically. Subordinates are expected to understand what their commander is trying to accomplish and why, so they can exercise initiative when circumstances change unexpectedly. This approach acknowledges that commanders making plans at headquarters cannot anticipate every situation their subordinates might encounter in the field. Stout's orders were to photograph the airfield at Peleliu and return. The intent behind those orders was to gather intelligence about threats to the invasion force. When Stout discovered a critical threat that intelligence had missed, he faced a choice: follow the letter of his orders, photograph and return, or fulfill the intent of his mission, protect the invasion force. He chose intent over instruction. This decision required several forms of courage: physical courage to attack a heavily defended target alone, moral courage to accept responsibility for violating explicit orders, intellectual courage to trust his assessment of the situation over official intelligence estimates, professional courage to risk his career on a decision that could have resulted in court-martial if his judgment proved wrong. Modern military doctrine increasingly emphasizes this type of decentralized decision-making. In complex operations, subordinates often have better situational awareness than commanders operating from distant headquarters. Rigid adherence to orders, when circumstances have changed dramatically, can lead to mission failure or unnecessary casualties. The key is developing subordinates who understand their commander's intent deeply enough to make good decisions when they must deviate from plans. The Navy's decision to award Stout the Navy Cross rather than court-martial him sent a powerful message throughout the service. Initiative, sound judgment, and adaptation to changing circumstances were valued over rigid obedience. Stout's disobedience was actually the highest form of following orders. He accomplished what his commanders would have ordered him to do if they had possessed his real-time knowledge of the situation. This principle extends beyond military operations into any organizational structure that must respond to rapidly changing circumstances. Whether in business, emergency response, or crisis management, leaders must develop subordinates who can make decisions without constant supervision when time doesn't permit consultation with higher authority. Technical analysis. How one pilot destroyed 40 aircraft from a purely tactical perspective, Stout's attack demonstrated exceptional target analysis and fire discipline. 40 aircraft would seem to require 40 separate attacks, an impossible task for a single fighter. But Stout recognized that destroying the aircraft directly wasn't necessary. He only needed to create conditions that would destroy them indirectly. His target prioritization focused on fuel drums rather than aircraft. Each 50 caliber incendiary round that struck an aviation fuel drum created an explosion and fire that could engulf multiple aircraft. The tightly packed aircraft positions ensured fire would spread rapidly from one plane to adjacent ones. Once burning aircraft exploded, their fuel tanks rupturing, their ammunition cooking off, their bombs detonating. The resulting fires and blast effects would destroy nearby aircraft without requiring direct hits. This cascade effect, where one successful attack triggers multiple secondary effects, is the goal of all effective targeting. Rather than requiring 40 separate actions to destroy 40 aircraft, Stout required perhaps 6 to 8 well-placed bursts into fuel dumps. Each burst initiated a cascade of destruction that consumed multiple targets. His approach angles also demonstrated tactical sophistication. Coming in low and fast minimized his exposure to anti-aircraft fire. Attacking from different directions on his two passes prevented gunners from pre-positioning and made tracking more difficult. Timing his second pass before defenders could fully recover from the shock of the first attack maintained momentum and confusion. The decision to leave immediately after expending ammunition showed tactical discipline. Many pilots, caught up in combat excitement, linger to assess damage or look for additional targets. This often results in being shot down after the mission objective has already been accomplished. Stout recognized when to stop not when every aircraft was destroyed, but when his ammunition was exhausted and his mission was accomplished. Staying longer would have been risk without benefit. Modern fighter pilots study this mission not just for its historical significance, but for the tactical lessons it demonstrates. Target analysis, vulnerability exploitation, cascade effects, approach angles, and knowing when to disengage all remain relevant in contemporary air combat operations. Robert Stout, the man behind the mission. After the war, Major Robert F. Cowboy Stout returned to California and lived quietly. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, and when he did, he downplayed his accomplishments. The Navy Cross sat in a drawer, not displayed on a wall. Friends who knew him during the post-war years described a man who was uncomfortable with attention or praise. When asked about the Peleliu attack, Stout's typical response was dismissive. "I saw planes that needed destroying, so I destroyed them. Any pilot would have done the same." But this self-deprecation masked the reality that most pilots would not have done the same. Most would have followed orders, radioed back intelligence, and let the chain of command handle the situation through proper channels. Stout's children grew up knowing their father had served in the Pacific, but they didn't learn the details of his wartime service until decades later. This reticence was common among World War II veterans, particularly those who had experienced intense combat. The generation that fought that war tended to view their service as duty rather than heroism, something that needed to be done rather than something deserving special recognition. The full significance of Stout's mission remained largely unknown outside military aviation circles until historians began researching Pacific air operations in detail decades after the war. When researchers cross-referenced his Navy Cross citation with Japanese records, American after-action reports, and reconnaissance photographs, they realized the full scope of what he'd accomplished. One man, one aircraft, 8 minutes, 40 enemy aircraft destroyed, potentially 1,000 lives saved. By any measure, it represented one of the most successful solo strikes in naval aviation history. No other pilot in World War II destroyed as many enemy aircraft in a single mission. Robert F. Cowboy Stout died in 2005 at the age of 89. After his death, his family finally shared his story publicly, granting interviews to military historians and allowing publication of his mission reports and personal accounts. Military aviation museums began displaying information about the Peleliu airfield attack as an example of individual courage and tactical brilliance. His legacy lives in every tactical training course that teaches initiative over rigid obedience, adaptation over inflexibility, and trust in the judgment of people on the ground. The military learned from Stout and pilots like him that sometimes the best course of action is the one nobody ordered you to take. Lessons for modern leadership. The story of Cowboy Stout's attack on Peleliu Airfield resonates beyond military operations. It offers profound lessons about leadership, decision-making under pressure, and organizational culture. First, organizations must cultivate leaders at all levels who understand not just what to do, but why they're doing it. When Stout understood that his mission's purpose was to protect the invasion force, he could adapt his actions when circumstances required deviation from his specific orders. Organizations that emphasize rote obedience over understanding create subordinates who cannot adapt when situations change unexpectedly. Second, effective organizations must create environments where subordinates feel empowered to exercise judgment. Stout knew he might face court-martial for his actions, yet he acted anyway because he believed it was right. Organizations that severely punish any deviation from plans, even when that deviation leads to success, train their people to be passive and inflexible. Third, information from the field often proves more accurate than assessments made at headquarters. Intelligence officers, reviewing aerial photographs and intercepted communications, had concluded Peleliu's northern airfield was abandoned. Stout, looking at the airfield with his own eyes, saw 40 aircraft preparing for launch. Organizations must maintain healthy skepticism about assessments that haven't been validated on the ground, and must be willing to rapidly update their understanding when field reports contradict previous assumptions. Fourth, the person closest to a problem often has the best perspective on how to solve it. Stout couldn't have known with certainty that attacking alone was the correct decision, but he had more complete information about the immediate tactical situation than any commander looking at maps aboard USS Hornet. Organizations benefit when they trust front-line personnel to make decisions without requiring approval for every action. Fifth, speed of action often matters more than perfection of planning. A proper strike package attacking Peleliu's northern airfield would have been more carefully coordinated and would have involved less risk to individual pilots. But it also would have taken hours longer to organize and execute. Those hours would have given the Japanese time to disperse their aircraft or launch them. Stout's imperfect, risky solo attack succeeded precisely because it happened immediately at the critical moment. These lessons apply broadly to any organization operating in competitive, rapidly changing environments. Whether in business responding to market shifts, emergency services responding to crises, or military forces responding to threats, success often depends on empowering people throughout the organization to exercise judgment and take initiative. Conclusion: when rules must be broken, sometimes the most heroic thing a person can do is refuse to follow orders, not out of cowardice, not out of rebellion, but because the situation demands action that rigid adherence to procedure would prevent. Robert Cowboy Stout understood this instinctively. When confronted with a choice between doing what he was told and doing what needed to be done, he chose the mission over the orders. He chose the lives of Marines over his own career. He chose effectiveness over compliance. His legacy challenges us to think deeply about the nature of duty and obedience. Duty doesn't mean blindly following orders regardless of circumstances. Duty means understanding what you're trying to accomplish and doing whatever is necessary to accomplish it, even when that requires deviating from plans. Obedience doesn't mean never questioning instructions. Obedience means following orders when they make sense and having the courage to disobey them when circumstances have changed so dramatically that rigid compliance would lead to disaster. The next time you face a situation where following established procedures conflicts with obvious necessity, where the rules seem wrong given what you know that others don't, remember Cowboy Stout circling over that airfield at Peleliu. He knew what needed to happen. He knew the cost if he was wrong. He knew he might face punishment even if he was right. And he did it anyway because the alternative was worse. That decision, made in seconds under intense pressure, saved hundreds of lives and changed the course of a battle. It stands as one of the most remarkable examples of individual initiative and courage in the Pacific War. A testament to what one person can accomplish when they trust their judgment and refuse to let procedure triumph over purpose. Major Robert F. Cowboy Stout flew 63 combat missions during World War II, but he'll be remembered for 8 minutes on September 12, 1944, when he chose to disobey orders, and in doing so, saved 1,000 lives. Sometimes, the greatest act of obedience is knowing when to disobey.